Welcome to today's Automotive Fleet webinar, Data Intelligence for Long-Term Strategic Planning, presented by Holman. I'm Martin Ramju, Managing Editor of the Fleet Group, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We encourage you to ask questions during the webinar at any point, and we will try to address them all. If we do not get to yours, we will contact you by email with a response after the event. I am joined by our speaker panelists today, Jennifer Kayott, Director of Strategic Sourcing at BNSF, Trip O'Neil, Vice President of Strategic Services at Holman, Ed Powell, Director of Consulting Services at Holman. Welcome to our panelists and thank you for being here. Now, briefly tell us a little bit more about yourselves, starting with Jennifer.
So I'm Jennifer Kayott, Director at BNSF. I have responsibility for our fleet program. A little bit of context, the BNSF fleet is about 8,000 vehicles, and we run the gamut from a passenger vehicle all the way up through heavy-duty large vehicles.
Trip.
Good afternoon, everybody. Martin, I oversee what we call strategic services within Holman's fleet management business. And that's basically a few different business units that work with and support our large, complex customers. Anything from relationship management, obviously what we're here to talk about today, which is our consulting services team.
Thank you, Trip. My name is Ed Powell. I'm the Director of Holman Consulting Services, and we work and partner with some of our largest clients, such as Jennifer and her team, to help solve complex business challenges that they have. Especially given the dynamic fleet space that we're all operating in.
All right, great. It's good to have you. So before we get into the meat of the topic here, could you please give us an overview of Holman and how it works with fleet operations?
Sure, Martin. I guess I'll take that one. I'll make a plug for Holman. We're celebrating 100 years in business next year. We are a family-controlled business, our third generation of leadership. Mindy Holman is our chairperson. The business consists really of three basic components, two of which work hand in hand together and are really applicable for today's conversation. That's our fleet mobility business. Many that are probably joining us today know the name ARI. That was the business name that we operated under until last year when we branded all the businesses as one under Holman. But we are a global fleet and mobility management provider. But also within the fleet and mobility business, we have a insurance and risk management firm that we can support customers from risk prevention, risk mitigation, and even providing insurance policies. And we operate those primarily here in the United States. The manufacturing distribution business, basically, Jennifer's fleet, one of the cool things that we get to do is help literally design, engineer, and build trucks for customers like BNSF. So we do anything from something as simple as a wrapped vehicle that may be used in the field by a sales or service person, but we certainly get up into some really complex builds. Vehicles that cost a couple $100,000 that can go out and literally lay railroad track anywhere in rural America. We also do parts distribution and components manufacturing for the things that go into the vehicles build. But what a lot of the fleet customers don't know is our founding division. That's our retail business. We are in automotive retailing. We're one of the largest privately held dealership groups in the United States. Most of the brands we have are on the premium, higher end brands, but we operate along the Eastern Seaboard, Rocky Mountain areas, and the West Coast. So a little bit about Holman, and certainly excited next year to celebrate 100 years in business.
All right, well, that's certainly quite an accomplishment. I know you also have a lot of consulting services. Ed, want to give us a quick rundown of that?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So our consulting services team is part of our fleet and mobility division. And we work and partner with a lot of the strategic services and larger accounts within Holman in order to provide complex support to solve business challenges. So a lot of our customers will come to us. They're facing a challenge around, when do I cycle my assets? We're facing this issue with an operational concern within our business. Can you provide us some advice on how to fix it? And we come in with a classic consulting approach. We vet out everything that's happening. We develop a scope of work. we understand objectives, we interview stakeholders, and most importantly, we analyze and review a whole lot of data in order to help drive business results and bring forward recommendations. And the story we're going to talk a little bit about today was an engagement that we had with BNSF around their capital strategy and how we were able to use data, analytics, et cetera, to help solve for some of those pressing challenges that they had. And the nice part is we do have a team of a lot of experienced fleet professionals, but also a lot of folks coming in with strong data and analytics backgrounds, because sifting through all of that information is a very time-consuming and sometimes complicated process. And our job is to help make that easier for our clients.
Okay. Well, speaking of sifting, data is obviously a vast topic, which is why we often hear the term big data. But let's start simple by outlining the primary ways data can work for fleets and what they have to work through.
Yeah, sure. So when we look at it, decision-making requires information, especially good decision-making. So you're kind of running the gamut between, am I making a decision based on a gut instinct or feeling, which can be positive and everyone does sometimes, or am I making a decision based on a whole lot of information and data that would back it up and help prove out where we're going to happen within that? And more business, I feel, over especially the past 20, 30 years, has elevated from a lot of strong gut decision-making processes into being more data-backed. If you don't have the data to support your recommendations, to understand the impact of where you're going, and most importantly, be relatively accurate with it, given your conditions and things that you can put on that, that's how decisions are made in business, and that's how you gain consensus to move forward, especially as the number of stakeholder groups have included. The challenge with that is when you have so much data, especially in the fleet space today, between programs where you're generating maintenance repair orders, you're generating telematics events, fuel transactions, all of this information coming together, it kind of becomes very hard to know where to start. And that's where we get into the paralysis by analysis problem, which is when you try to boil the ocean to find a seashell, it can take a lot of time and you can waste a lot of effort in order to get there. So sometimes it's really about understanding the balance, and we can talk about this a little bit more as we go through our example of understanding the balance between analyzing and driving your data resources towards solving for specific business objectives versus going out and trying to see what might be the opportunity. So it is about a business understanding combined with information to help drive recommendations on the decision. And that's where we get into that third bullet point there. Understanding the objectives, understanding the variety of stakeholders involved. What are we actually trying to accomplish? How can we move that needle forward? And what can we provide in order to make that work? And then once you've come to that decision, once you've implemented it, you've put it out there, you don't need to replicate the analysis over and over and over again. As part of that process, you need to understand key KPIs that can help you continue to monitor your success and move forward. And that's one of the big things that we're working with a lot of our clients on now, is understanding what are those real KPIs, the metrics for success that can help drive long-term improvement in the fleet and help us accomplish those objectives.
The KPIs, if you will, probably give you the trust but verify with a customer.
It is. And by the time you get through those executive stakeholder levels, because that's one of the big things we work a lot with, right? There's a lot of people involved. In certain cases, we're talking about spending hundreds of millions of dollars. Our numbers have to be right. Our analysis has to be on point. But once the decision's made, the executive doesn't want to see that over and over and over again. So understanding, hey, these are the key definitions of success. This is what we're going to monitor and report out on going forward becomes very critical.
Now, in some of the fleets you've worked with, I'm kind of fascinated with this phrase, paralysis by analysis. What are some of the common obstacles or problems they encounter when they first try to sort through this, and how do they overcome them?
Well, it generally starts because, at least in my perspective, we start at the end in that we try to analyze everything in order to find something to build an initiative around. And we've all heard these things like, go find me the diamonds or the nuggets or the opportunities, whatever it is. And that intrinsically begins like, go explore and see what you can find. And there could be some value in that from time to time. But if you reverse that process, if you start with understanding what you're trying to solve for, where's the organization trying to go? What is the business trying to accomplish? How can we bring those things together? A random example of that would be, we had a telecom customer, a little outside of our example here, who needed to improve the on-time service delivery of their vehicles. just starting with that premise helped us zero in on what needed to be analyzed, the factors that could pull the lever, versus trying to find huge ranging opportunities that are out there for improving downtime or whatever it would be. So it really starts with understanding the problem you're trying to solve for before you just go out looking for a problem that the data may present.
Which I would say problem though, right? It takes getting all of the stakeholders almost sometimes to the table together, because everybody has a different, if you will, fingerprint on trying to solve the problem, but what they're looking at might be, how does your part contribute to the CEO's ultimate goal? Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. And I would add from a end user perspective, sometimes paralysis by analysis, right? As you get so far into the data that you're trying to develop that absolute perfect solution. And the way that the auto markets are moving today, the way the ordering banks are, allocation, all of those things, we're not going to have the perfect solution. We're not going to be able to iron out every little thing because we need to make a decision and go. So while I rely on the consulting team to provide me, here's your great data, here's how you can look at it, here's how it is, but you can't get stuck in analyzing it because you can't do it perfectly, and you've got to move with it and not be paralyzed by, okay, how do I perfectly allocate out my exact number of trucks from Ford? We've got to order them. We have a timeline. Use that data to guide a intelligent, educated decision, right? Instead of being paralyzed by just analyzing it forever.
So would you say it's like directionally accurate?
Yes, it's very directionally. I mean, in a perfect world, you can execute that. But yes, set me in the right direction. Give me the information that I can use to make an informed decision the best I can in the parameters that I sit in today, because that's the reality of, running our business.
I think that's a great point, Jennifer. The being comfortable with directional data, being comfortable with something that moves us in the correct direction in order to accomplish our objectives versus perfection. And that is kind of how you escape that paralysis by analysis trap.
Now, I'd like to move on to a company that is definitely not paralyzed. There's no better way to learn about data usage than from a successful real-life example. So I'd like to get into this case study with your client, BNSF, and how the fleet has unfolded with its use of data and how it has implemented some of these tools and some of these strategies. So Jennifer, would you like to kind of give us an overview of the BNSF fleet?
Sure. As I mentioned, we have about 8,000 vehicles in our fleet, and our fleet, we run all over the western 2/3 of the United States, a little bit into Canada. So a few years ago, we were really looking at how do we get on the right replacement cycle? How do we determine what our capital investment should be in our fleet every year? As Ed mentioned before, we were doing a lot of kind of gut type analysis. This trade master over here said his truck's really bad. Maybe we should replace that run, right? Trying to figure out how we go through all of that and get that better analysis together. So we really turned to the Holman team to help us, look at how do we use our data? How do we use the information that we have on these trucks to really develop a plan to get our fleet on a correct replacement cycle that's going to provide us kind of the lowest total cost of ownership as well as reliability within the fleet. And Ed, do you want to talk about some of the data points and stuff that you guys analyzed?
Yeah, that's really the phase one of the project, right, is understanding all of the various data elements that we had to analyze to be able to do that. So when we talk about volume of data, if you look at a fleet like BNSF and their 8,000 vehicles, there were probably several 100 million rows of data that went into the model that ultimately helped determine that TCO. So we're looking at over probably about a 3 to 5 year time period for baseline. So that's an important thing with data. You don't need all data for all time. You need the right set of data put through the right model in order to get where you want to be. Take about 3 to 5 years worth of data generated by those 8,000 vehicles. Every maintenance transaction, every fuel transaction, understanding the resale value of the assets, the cost of acquiring it from a capital perspective, the weighted average cost of capital for financing that vehicle over time, the time value of money, because we're doing a life cycle, it's occurring over an extended period of time. And we essentially run all of that data through a large model that we dubbed VESSEL, Vehicle Economic Service Life. And at the end of it, the vessel model produces a series of calculations that helps you compare various life cycle scenarios. And that was awesome to do for BN because BN has a lot of specs. So the analyst team involved, shout out to them, ran that model probably about 50 plus times, looking at all of the different permutations of how to do it. The more interesting piece was ensuring that you're getting the right sample sizes. So a lot of people like to use analytics in a lot of different ways and different platforms. And one of the lessons we learned from going through BN is, how do we ensure that we have the right sample size and the right accuracy level of the data to count on what we're doing? So that's really how we approached the problem from day one. And we really had to figure out what is the accurate way to model the fleet, put the data through the model. And then that was kind of the hard part from the data side. The more difficult part was, how do we message and communicate this to all of the various stakeholders at BNSF to gain alignment? And what made the overall project even more critical was the current economic climate that we're really operating in. I think it was, Jennifer, you probably know the number better than I do, but the capital value of BNSF's fleet, so the amount of money needed in order to help maintain that proper life cycle, had increased by almost 20 or 30% just in the past couple of years. So if you think of a fleet at the scale of BN, which has a value well north of $1 billion, 20 or 30% is a lot of money. And talking about ensuring that we're maintaining accurate investment rates so that we're addressing things like growing operating expenses, increasing downtime, those were all very critical to it.
For those that don't know, just curious, do you know off the top of your head how many specs BN actually has?
So today, active specs, I believe we have 83, but when you look at our fleet, we have vehicles that are 26 years old. And so if you go across the whole gamut, we're right around about the 145, 150 mark.
Wow.
So
I
asked
that for a reason, because we have some customers that have just called a handful of specs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you folks, when we use, kind of the word a complex challenge to solve for, you have light, medium, heavy duty, DOT regulated. Safety is a massive topic in the world of the railroads, right? So that certainly adds to the layers of complexity just when you're trying to solve for some sort of problem.
For sure, for sure.
I'd like to back up a little bit. You mentioned KPIs and specs. I've also seen the phrase primary and secondary metrics. Could you give us some examples of what primary and secondary metrics are when it comes to evaluating and analyzing a fleet?
So in terms of like primary and secondary metrics, a lot of times we're going to look for those things to understand what is the main driver of the goal we're trying to accomplish versus the secondary item that's an influencer within that. So right now, there's a lot of focus on managing operating expenses and downtime over time within fleets. It's a very common topic. We can't buy as many assets as we would want to. So in that case, your primary metrics are understanding what is your total operating expense. Generally, you'd want to control for that in some way by unit of utilization. So that's where things like maintenance cost per gallon or cost per mile or cost per unit of product delivered or whatever it would be, whatever represents work within the fleet, to then control that. That's a primary metric. Total amount of downtime experience, that's a primary metric. But a lot of secondary metrics can contribute to that number significantly. Preventative maintenance compliance is probably every fleet manager's favorite metric because we all love it. You can't escape it. Preventative maintenance is very important. It influences both of those. But it in of itself is not going to drive those primary numbers. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So that's sort of how we break down those. You really want to understand, what are you trying to control? The secondary metrics end up being the individual things that you manage, the levers you pull per se, generally a collection of those things in order to influence a primary metric that's really aligned to a business goal or an objective.
All right, so when looking at capital planning, I know for some fleet operations that can sound a bit intimidating. What are some of the first factors they need to consider when they start capital planning? And I'd like to keep an eye towards present economic circumstances and challenges in the automotive industry. how can data help the fleets adjust their strategies and their forecasts in tough times, especially when they're doing capital planning?
So I'll start with kind of even how in this current environment, how we ran our capital planning cycle this year. So we start with an analysis from Holman, right? As Ed laid out, we have the vessel analysis. We can look at our different specs in our fleet and understand what is the optimum life cycle of those vehicles. I'm not sure in the current environment we're hitting optimum life cycle with anything, right? Everyone is trying to stretch and make it go further. So as we do that and we look at the data that we have, one of our first questions back to Holman that they helped us with is, what kind of vehicles can go further? You know, inherently, I know a passenger vehicle like a Ford Explorer, typically I can maybe get that to go a little further than one of my section trucks that has a big crane on it and a welder, and it's, you know, it's more over its life than what others are. So we tried to look at that and where can we stretch our fleet based on, you know, where we're sitting. Also in the capital planning cycle, right, I always start with my ideal scenario, but I'm sure us, like almost everyone else out there, no one ever fully funds you. It's always a struggle to get capital. And especially in a year like this, where Ed mentioned that my fleet value, thus my capital needs, have gone up 30-40% over the last couple of years. So that's a much bigger number. So as we were saying, you know, here's my ideal, I need to scale back. I've got to fit within our business parameters, right, of what capital we can allocate to this, especially in our fleet, because we do not generate revenue at the railroad, right? The railroad vehicle fleet is a support and maintenance fleet. So the next thing I look to Holman to help me with is, how do I then prioritize the dollars I have? We added a component to our analysis called criticality, because some trucks I need to run the railroad. I always say the expression, you know, will it stop trains? Yes, broken rail will stop trains. So I need those trucks to be up and running and working to run my business. Those are going to be more critical. So if I only get a handful of dollars, I'm going to replace those sooner than I might replace a yard truck that helps us move material around the yard, but maybe I can do that with a Kubota. Maybe I could do it with something else, right? So we look to get advice and analysis then with that data on criticality. And those factors really come into our capital plan and help us, you know, develop what is the right plan for us, how do we fit within our business capital allocation, and then how do we go forward and execute on that?
I think if we step that back out maybe to a slightly more like generic example of where to start and where we advise a lot of clients. Let's say you're operating a very basic fleet. So number one, understand what the actual capital value replacement of your fleet is. So that's the first thing. How much would it cost you to replace your entire fleet if it went away tomorrow and you had to buy all new vehicles? Then you want to understand what your life cycle is. And there's a lot of different ways that you can determine that. You can partner with Holman, we could help you do it, or you figure it out on your own wherever you want it to be. Let's say it's 5 years, simple math. 5 years life cycle means you need to be cycling 20% of your fleet every single year. 20% of $1 million is $200,000. That's your targeted annual capital budget. And when you start there and you understand how much should you be investing in your fleet at that given point in time, then the other decisions can kind of flow from there. You want to understand prioritization. Criticality is so super important. What is the vehicle that's going to disrupt the ability of my organization to generate revenue if it wasn't there to do its job? Start there and then work your way backwards through the fleet until you find the least useful or most productive asset that you happen to have. And then that one you should probably consider just getting rid of because it's probably not really needed.
But it's probably worth mentioning that when you talk to customers about a plan like this, so you mentioned, what if a fleet that's got $1 million worth of vehicles out there, right? The capital planning directly connects to total cost of ownership, right? And it moves, right? It moves with energy prices, it moves with vehicle resale values, it certainly moves with the cost of vehicles new and the availability. You mentioned it, Jennifer, right? Everybody's stretching their fleets a little bit longer than normal right now. But understanding when's that perfect point in time where it almost becomes cost prohibitive to keep something in service. And then you have to cross-reference it with criticality. If I'm If I own an air conditioning contractor company, maybe all of those vehicles are utmost critical, because if I can't make a service call, I'm not generating any revenue, right? So those are things I know that we help a lot of customers with to help them back into a capital strategy.
Yeah, a lot of times there's like especially on the capital side and replacement strategies in general, which a lot of data goes towards that point of figuring that out. There's like a logic fallacy around the asset is free as long as it's depreciated and I continue to hold on to it. Well, that's not really true when you look at it through a macro TCO piece. There's lost opportunity around resale. There's ever increasing maintenance expense associated with that unit and more complex failures. There's declining productivity. So there's two things we look at that are always true within the model. When you look at it, controlled by utilization, over time, costs will increase in terms of operating expense to maintain the vehicle, and it will produce less work. Those two things cost you money, even when the asset's fully depreciated. So capturing that correct time where you can gain back some of that resale value on the asset and you can head off some of those larger expense buckets allows you to really balance all of those things and achieve a more optimal cost outcome.
That kind of ties into your fleet though, right? I mean, it's almost refreshing. I think the first time we met one another, I mean, you guys were talking about, we need to cycle more vehicles, right? A lot of times when Ed's team goes in, it's the opposite way around. But do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because that's navigating current market conditions and trying to preserve and get capital, but then also being constrained because it's almost harder to spend your money right now. You have the money to spend. You've got to get the things to spend the money.
Yeah, it is harder to spend the money right now, which is kind of ironic. Because we've done a really good job of communicating up to our leadership, the criticality, the importance of cycling the fleet. So it is hard to spend. But I think, you know, what I'll say to kind of your first question of going back to the impact, I'll go back to, you know, the year 2020 and the COVID year. And, you know, that was a really good year for BNSF in terms of our fleet, mostly because we had committed the capital. We had placed orders earlier in 2019. We like to get ahead of our ordering cycle. And we had the ability that we did not have to cancel orders, and yet others were canceling. And the best thing about that year for me and for me being able to tell this story is that we were able not only to deliver our plan, but we delivered our plan earlier in the year than what we ever had. So getting those new vehicles in, instead of getting them into cycle in the September, October, November deliveries, we were delivering them earlier in the year, and we saw a direct impact on our maintenance expense. And so year over year, even, you know, back then inflation wasn't terrible, but, you know, inflationary costs, aging fleet, we actually saw a decrease in our overall maintenance, which has just helped me tremendously to share that story of this is how your capital plan can impact your maintenance expense, right? Your total cost of ownership. So seeing things like that and being able to leverage that, it really gave us evidence to the story that Ed will very well tell you, but sometimes, you know, your leaders are like, I don't know, is this really, really true? I mean, we all know, yes, a new vehicle gets less maintenance, but I just spent a whole bunch of money on that new vehicle and I wouldn't have spent that much in maintenance. So, you know, finding an anecdotal year like that, but really being able to show that was really beneficial to us and has really helped us in showing that total cost of ownership story and how it can positively impact your TCO when you get your fleet on a productive cycle.
I'd like to get into the process of developing and executing a data plan with process point one. Could you talk through just some of the main pillars of this and how it evolves?
Yeah, I mean, I could at least take the first part around the partnership, and then certainly I'll pass it over to Ed because he and his entire team dive into the guts of data to help solve the problems for our customers. But I would say, like anything, it starts with a really strong partnership. And a strong partnership, if you want to simplify it, comes down to two basic things. Number one, a firm understanding of the customer, their business, the personalities, their goals and objectives, and candidly, whatever challenges or threats that they might be facing in the marketplace. Jennifer's talking about, you know, that year the world shut down in COVID. Well, we understand that, you know, they service a lot of industries, but intermodal transportation is huge for that business. And all of us were at home buying things online, that all comes through a port, gets on a train, gets to other parts of the country. So understanding the customer. And then once we kind of get a good grasp of a challenge that they're facing, it's resourcing correctly, which I would say that I think that that's something that we at Holman try to do better than anybody else in the industry. At least that's our goal. But Ed, that's where you and the team come in. Do you want to take it from there forward?
Yeah. So building off the strong partnership, and the strong partnership is very important. I mean, obviously, Jennifer's sitting here with us today, but there's plenty of times where we challenge each other. We're constructive in our feedback, and we're honest in that partnership. And that honesty is a very important part of the overall relationship, because the partnership to get something like a capital plan done extends well beyond just the folks that are immediately involved in the project. It also extends to multiple teams and departments within BNSF. So to get something big done, you often need to have big relationships. And, Jennifer has those relationships at BNSF, and we're strong partners on that end, and we bring everyone on our end to the table as well. So the number one thing is really understanding what is the most important thing to the organization and having an invested interest in that. We talked a lot about optimal within the model standpoint, but optimal on a data model does not necessarily always translate to what's optimal for business conditions at the moment or what's reality at the moment. So coming in and understanding what are the challenges that face a business and an organization, what were the challenges that BN was facing that we were trying to solve for, all of that largely supersedes whatever optimal state or Shangri-La state of existence that we think our data models might help lead someone to. And that's a big difference, right? We want to ensure that the recommendations and how we're bringing things forward are based in reality. And reality in this current environment is shifting constantly. And once we have those priorities understood, we're looking to really bring forward all of the data and analysis that we can to develop that clear picture. And yes, I know the slide says optimal investment scenario. That is where it all begins. We want to understand what is optimal, and then we want to work back from there to get ourselves to reality.
But I think it's important, Jennifer, you should comment on this. We may think we have all the right solutions and answers, but the one who gets to determine reality is you, the customer, right? So having the customer involved in every part of the conversation, including calling us out or keeping us on track, no pun intended, right? But it has to be a back and forth. And I know we've done a lot of things together where we may think we're going down a path, but we have an open, honest conversation, listen to you and say, no, we got to change course.
Yeah, I mean, I will totally agree with that, definitely we can be going down a path, you guys see something and all of that, but you definitely are always open to the feedback, always open to, okay, I get this, but for my business, this is the way that it is. We need to look at it in a different way, execute in a different way. And I will say, I think that from a customer standpoint, I appreciate that, you say I'm the ultimate decider on that. But I also believe from a customer standpoint, though, that, you have to be able to willing to hear the feedback both ways. Like I joke all the time with our account executive over there. I always say, you need to tell us no sometimes. It's okay. You can tell me no, right? But that's part of that partnership, because I'm going to throw ideas out or challenge something and challenge me back. But it really develops that. I want that collaboration, right? I want us all pinging off of each other. I may be more of an expert in the railroad and railroad operations and fleet usage, but Ed is way more of a data expert than I am, right? So I think all of us working in that collaboration and having that strong partnership where we're comfortable to challenge each other and we trust in each other when we tell each other, yeah, that'll work, no, that won't. That is really key to having any of that success and really managing a relationship and really getting to where you need to go.
Completely agree with you. 100%.
So I think if we take that out of the example of what we were doing in this moment here, I think we look at maybe what other fleet managers are dealing with. They're thinking, man, where do I start with this? I think to me the checklist takeaway on that is understand who your stakeholders are. Build and understand those relationships. Who are the influencers there? Fleet is generally a service department, even within the business that it's a part of. You're helping support operations. You're helping support, the finance team has an interest in what you're doing. HR most likely has an interest in what you're doing. So understand who your stakeholders are, who you need to have a partnership with so that you can collectively understand what's most important to your organization and why you're going on that journey. And so all of those things that they begin with relationships and they begin with real business conversations before you ever look at a scrap of data to try to push something forward. And so that would be my advice to the fleet managers out there is connect with your stakeholders, understand where you're going and why. Then you can look, now that you have your problem you're going to solve for, you can start to look at that data to understand how you're going to solve it and what the information is telling you to go on.
You made me think of something, just a question for both of you. Not that I'm the moderator, but there are times that
Doing fine.
will throw something at us and either the contact within the account or certainly they'll ask us to do things. And we're talking about data and we're talking about analysis. You mentioned boil the ocean. You can find yourself spinning your tires doing tremendous amounts of work that go nowhere. Just curious from both the operator perspective, but also on the support standpoint for anybody listening, how do you be smart with not getting pulled into the trap of working on, call it a deep dive in a spreadsheet for a week straight that your boss never even looks at, right? How do you prevent doing that so you're targeted and use your time wisely?
I would say, the way you prevent doing that is typically for my team, I would say, what is our end goal, right? What are we trying to accomplish? Because I don't like just looking at a bunch of data and going, what could we tackle, right? What are we trying to accomplish? What is our end goal? What are we driving towards? So that you stay focused and you can evaluate and see, am I going to get to that point? Is this data going to help me with that? Or am I going somewhere that either I don't have the data for, or this isn't the right data? I think that's one thing. And I think too, before you're deep diving for a week, talk to some other people, have some collaboration, make sure that you're understanding, all of the pieces and facets, because you wouldn't want to go down a path, that just doesn't make sense. Like I think of, if you're looking at fleets and you have different types of fleets, right? So if you have someone who's assuming, oh, well, we want to put EVs in the fleet and they can come to this yard and charge every night, well, that's great. And if you do all this analysis based on that, that's one thing. But when you look at my fleet, more than 70% of my fleet does not report to a home base. They're at different locations every night. So while you might be developing this strategy for me, having that partnership, that full understanding of where you're going is really important, because that will stop you from deep diving into something that then may not even be applicable. Yeah. So, just talking, keeping perspective, and, kind of doing that. And I will say too, when we were talking about, Ed saying, understanding fleets, I will say too, for fleet managers, if you have a fleet management company, not just understanding your stakeholders, but bring your fleet management your company out to see your fleet in action, so they can see how your fleet actually operates and what it does, because all of our fleets have very unique characteristics, and them just being able to see it makes such a difference to understanding what your fleet is doing, how it works, and it'll help them develop ideas and generate, thoughts so that are more applicable to you and can really help you advance what you're trying to accomplish.
A good point.
Yeah, on the process end of that, I go back to a little bit of high school science. Remember the scientific method. Start with a hypothesis. You understand what the challenges that your business is facing. Let's say it's improving reliability or whatever that happens to be, saving money. Name it whatever it is. Start with what you think the recommendation or the solution actually is, and then go through the process of understanding what things would need to be true in order for me to believe that recommendation is the one that we should take. And that'll help you start to frame up some of those areas and points of analysis that you actually need to pursue. You call it a hypothesis because you're testing it. And when you're doing the analysis, you're testing it, you're seeing what you can derive from it. And many times that hypothesis is going to have to change throughout that process, but you've started at least at a place and you've given yourself a starting point. So you're not falling into that boiling the ocean and trying to find everything that you can that's out there. So a lot of our things start with basically vetting what we think is the solution going to be. Half the time we disprove our initial thought. Half the time it actually pans out that our guts were kind of right, but now we have the data and the information to back it up.
I just want to let you know, you're making me think of curriculum night that I went to last night.
Oh.
Testing theories in fleet.
All right, well, there's more curriculum to get to here. Process point two, which kind of gets into it seems like the daily application of this, particularly the modeling and the forecasting. So wanted to start with you, Jennifer, just on a day-to-day basis with corralling all the data and applying it, real-time modeling, forecasting, segmenting vehicle groups. How does this all unfold on a typical day?
Very complicated. I mean, on a typical day, we've got some models, but when we were first putting it in place, it was a lot of digging into the data, collecting it all, getting all of our our specs together, the information on it, right? Putting that all together so that you can continue that process. And then as we go along on a day-to-day basis, it is tweaking that information and or leveraging that information to figure out what should I do for my fleet? What is the best path for my fleet? I don't have a large fleet team, and I definitely don't have a data analytics team. So I do rely on Holman to do a lot of that analysis for me. And I am able to say, we want to look at this differently, or we want to shift this. What does that mean to my fleet? And so we can rely on that. So I'll give an example of, we run our preventative maintenance schedule currently based on fuel burn. We have a lot of vehicles that will sit and idle. That's how we've done it for many years. But we considered, should we move to a different, scenario, whether it be based on mileage, whether it be based, on just a certain amount of time. So I was able to kind of work with the Holman team to run some analytics for me. Would that adjust my schedule? What would that look like for us in PMs, things like that. But really, leveraging them to help model that data. What would that forecasting be? And then to help us make a decision on, should we make a change or should we not make a change?
I think as we start getting down to in these process points, where it's sort of like that rubber meets the road, right? We've done our analysis. We have an understanding of what the perfect world would look like. But now we have to face the fact that we're not living in a perfect world, and we have to apply some level of solution to it, right? So how do we go about doing that? And I think this is really where you can get bogged down in a lot of that paralysis that we keep talking about, because you keep seeking perfect, right? We're gonna optimize everything within the game that we're given, right? So we want to step back from that a little bit. We just want to understand really where can we make the limited decisions we can to have the largest impact possible within that space. So if we're back and we're at our $1 million fleet, or we're at the HVAC company and we have a lot of assets that are important to us, we really have to start thinking through, within a limited allocation, within the current situation we're dealing with, how can I deploy those assets to have the largest positive impact on my fleet? In some cases, and this is where it's kind of, it's getting more complicated these days, and where the data can actually really help you, is it may not be replacing the oldest asset in your fleet as being the largest positive impact. If you have an older asset that's had a great maintenance history, it's been taken care of by the drivers, that may be an asset that's life cycle you need to extend out a little bit. It might be a vehicle with a questionable preventative maintenance history that's kind of nearing replacement term, but not there, and hasn't had a major component failure yet. That asset may make more sense for you to go ahead and replace. So understanding the data and the prioritization and the mix of vehicles and really what you're trying to drive for here helps prevent, to the extent possible, the impacts of the limited allocation and the situation that we're living in. And get to those secondary metrics that we keep talking about, is understanding like what influence do they have on those vehicles. So we talk about, preventative maintenance compliance over time. We talk about the vendor history usage, how that vehicle was operated, where it was operated from a telematics perspective or different areas. Those things can all help us paint that more complete picture around the life of that asset to help determine how we would prioritize it for replacement. Especially when you want to, today when you go out, you order 100 and they tell you can have 15, you better pick the best 15 to go ahead and replace it in that moment to maximize your bang for the buck.
So obviously a priority for fleet managers is controlling costs, especially in this environment. And I think you alluded to this earlier, but what is the right balance when you apply the data? In identifying those areas first where you need to cut costs, or choosing those areas where you have to cut costs and then applying the data? How do you back into that and find the right balance?
I think they almost kind of go a little bit hand in hand. I don't know if you start with one and go the opposite, or start with the opposite to go to one. Do you want to talk a little bit about, I mean, we recently were just, I mean, I think it's like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago together, we were together, and we had a pretty big team, right? We had some of the Holman team. We certainly had the leadership team at BN, but we talked about the strategic goals currently in place for, and this is from CEO down, within BN, and it had to do with what, Martin, the question is. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to prioritize right one over the other, but you do have to start somewhere. So what we try to do is look at, what's my optimum fleet? What's my optimum, replacement? What do I think that's going to cost me? Because of course, as we all sit here, pricing isn't always released for next year. I mean, I'm planning my 2024 cycle. Shoot, now we're starting to talk about our 2025 cycle, right? So what do we think that's going to be? What do we think it's going to look like? And so understanding that from a spend perspective, and how many vehicles does that mean I can replace? But then also looking at, what are those vehicles that I need to replace as well? And I don't like to, just keep it in a vacuum just with us. So we do a lot of interaction with our stakeholders, and we work with them on, how can we control costs? So for example, if I have an option that you can add on to a truck, and we'll say it's a $60,000 truck and this is a $10,000 option. Well, if you decide to add that on to 6 trucks, you just cost a truck. Can we forego this option? Do you absolutely have to have it? Because I could get you another truck, right? So working with them on trying to manage that cost side, or manage, we're putting a crane on. Can we go a little bit smaller crane this year and use these types of trucks maybe in a application where we don't lift as much so that our dollars can go further? So, some of that stakeholder interaction helps you control costs. Understanding, right, what your spend is and where you need to go, how many trucks or vehicles you need to be replacing, helps you actually know where you need to manage those costs. And then I'll also say, working with your partners in the business in terms of, should we diversify, right? We can diversify in OEMs. We can diversify in our upfitters that place extra on there. Those things help us maybe control costs, right? So it's a balance of, I always want to set my goal. This is really what I want and what's best for my fleet. So how do I work through that with my limited capital? Where can we, make small compromises to save costs that, when I save costs in my fleet plan, I don't give the dollars back. I turn it into another truck. So that always helps me motivate people as well. So, I know, like Martin, you want like a list, but you kind of have to juggle them all at the same time to come up with, again, not the perfect plan, but the best plan you can make at the current circumstances and the situations that you're in.
And I think we talk a little bit too, together about the other side of that coin is like the operating costs, right? Like your M&R budgets, and depending on the customer, certainly in your folks' case, that all kind of wraps into some of the holy grail metrics that you run the railroad by, right? So there is pressure to say, in a market where assets are getting older, you can't replace them like you normally do, and then you have inflationary pressures, labor, parts, et cetera. How do you measure and manage and control and ultimately lower some of those costs? You guys want to talk a little bit about that? Because I know that's a hot topic outside of capital plans whenever we're meeting.
Yeah, for everyone involved, the costs are going up all the time. And what we hear every single day is, I don't like that inflation is going up 14% or whatever it would happen to be this year. Make it not happen. And it would be great if that could be the case. But it really starts with understanding the intricacies of the interleave between how you're replacing your vehicles and that cadence, and how you're using them, that then generates and drives cost. So within cost buckets, so we really look at 2 things. One of them you have a direct level of control over. That's your capital. How quickly are you injecting, you're cycling your vehicles, et cetera? That's more of a central decision-making piece. The other aspects of that, you kind of set the stage with what you're doing in your capital side, right? So your outcome and your OpEx and other areas from that are going to be set by that. The rest of it's kind of behavior-based. And that's where the people part of fleet comes in. And that's really a lot more challenging is how are you going to go out and in Jennifer's case, get 8,000 drivers to change the way they do something in order to drive a savings initiative. So it's really about, to me, starting with understanding, let's measure cost and understand what are we actually trying to influence and change here. At the end of the day, for most people, it's cost to serve. Is my cost of doing the operation I need for the business, whether it's miles of track inspected, cans of soda delivered, whatever it would happen to be, what is my cost to serve? And then ultimately you want to lower that. And how you do it, you get your capital plan in place, and then you communicate clearly around the impact and the forecast that that's going to have on your OpEx. And then you look for opportunities to improve from there and some of those secondary metrics that come in.
All right, we've gotten kind of the 5-minute warning, and I think we might go over a few minutes, but I wanted to get to the next slide and just talk about the outcomes briefly before we get to some of the audience questions. I'll start with you, Jennifer. What have been the areas or the facets of your fleet operations where you have seen the biggest gains in efficiencies and also the largest cost savings because of the smart use of data?
So I'll say that the largest cost savings and really efficiency gains have come in having that smart capital plan. Because I mean, the reality is if you want to reduce your operating costs, your maintenance costs, get a new truck. That will definitely cut your maintenance. Usually they're more efficient in fuel, right? They're going to have less downtime. So they're, running all the time. I mean, that's the reality of it. Now, you're going to spend a lot to replace your entire fleet, right? But so optimizing that capital plan and that capital progress has really helped us see those gains and efficiencies and spend, making sure we're putting our dollars in the right place to see those savings and those efficiency improvements.
Trip, Ed, any observations on outcomes from the case study with regards to BNSF?
I think overall, I mean, my observations were I really enjoyed the process and working through it together collaboratively to get to that endpoint. And there's no greater satisfaction for myself and the folks on our team and Holman in general than helping our customers succeed in their core mission and what they're doing. And in this case, it was helping to put a safe, reliable, cost-effective vehicle in the hands of BNSF's employees so that the trains can keep running, as we say. And I feel like in that case, that was the outcome that we had, and that is an extreme sense of pride in having to be able to be a part of that.
I think just quickly to add on to that, I mean, one outcome typically leads to 3 or 4 more possible challenges. Or if you think about, running a marathon and you hit a certain time, now you want a PR at a different level. And that's the best partnerships we have. I mean, the work never ends. It just goes on to the next challenge. And how do we progressively get better with one another?
Okay. I know there's a lot more we could talk about, but we have set aside some time for some audience questions. And just to let everybody know, we are going to hold over just a few minutes past the hour. And there is an interesting question that has come in during this time with regards to AI. And one way to sum it up is how will future advances in AI improve the collection segmentation of data?
Martin, I have to say, this is the second time in this webcast that I've thought of curriculum night, because teachers were all talking about AI last night and not cheating in school. But Ed or Jennifer, I'll let you guys take the AI questions. I know you're dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, artificial intelligence has a lot of promise for the industry and where we're going. And we're already working with certain limited capabilities of it today. So if you think of like a tool like Power BI and how it's implemented, you can feed it a data set and you can ask it questions, and it tells you what the influencers are within that data set and how those types of things work. That's a version of artificial intelligence. But it's ultimately only as good as the information that we provide it to consume. So I definitely believe that we're going to have future states here where AI running on robust data sets and robust experiential learning fed into it by humans doing the hard work now will help us to more rapidly identify opportunities and outliers and drivers of behavior within it. So asking that question, hey, what is the optimal life cycle for my fleet? I don't know what the time horizon is, but at some point in the future, the AI is going to be able to tell us that. What you do with that information and how you apply it, I don't know if it's going to quite get there in a short time frame. It may. It is definitely going to be an industry revolutionizing technology in terms of how we apply and solve day-to-day challenges.
I know our entire information management organization, there's a lot from our CIO down that we're talking daily about applications, where this fits into the business, how it's going to change our business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll add that, we use some AI, but some bots and things like that at BNSF already for other data analysis, looking at our trains and things like that. And it definitely has good benefit. I think that Ed is spot on when you've got to have good data, because AI can't always understand that the data isn't the best. So, putting that work in now to make sure we have good, accurate data is important. And for me, I look forward to, not just being able to say to AI, what's the optimal life of my fleet, but really almost having an AI that can look at your data and tell you what you don't see, right? We're still very human dependent. It is dependent on us to come up with an idea or a solution. The data can only tell us what we're extrapolating out of it. So I am excited about just the possibility of AI seeing something else in the data that we're not seeing. It's almost like having an infinite team of people to look at it and get a different perspective, provide me that, diversity of thinking that I can't always get today because I don't have an unlimited team. So that excites me, and where that could go in the future and point me in directions that, I can't even know today.
Yeah, in the same breath as AI, you almost have to mention telematics. And just as kind of a final question here, how do fleet managers truly want a data-driven operation? How do they size up and evaluate telematics? How do they integrate that into the entire flow of data? I know that's a broad question, but if you could just give a few highlights.
So I'll start in that we have telematics on about half of our fleet. Now, we added telematics. Actually, it comes as a extended benefit. Our telematics provider is our electronic logging devices for our DOT compliance rules. So that is why we put the system in. As a benefit out of that, I do get telematics data, GPS location, speeds, all kinds of information out of there. And we've been having a lot of discussions on how can I use that data? Is it useful to me? What can I get out of it? And can I justify putting it on the rest of my fleet, right? Where is that value coming that would then offset the expense of the telematics on the rest of my fleet? But, we're not, how our fleet operates is very different than others. And so I think that's part of it, just does telematics bring value to you, and how many ways can we turn telematics into things? Because I'll tell you, it gives you great data. I mean, you definitely get more reliable odometers than what you get from Bob, who punched it in at the fuel pump when he got fuel, right? That kind of stuff is just so much better. And I think you can be more proactive in things, but you've got to balance cost with your fleet and, what value you're going to get. That's really my side. I know Ed he loves telematics because he's the data guy. So if you can give Ed more data, he's going to be happy.
I do love telematics, and I love the data that it provides. But I think to Jennifer's point, it's a very accurate one. You have to start with understanding what you're trying to solve for. And does the cost of implementing this provide me, is that the gateway to get the information I need to drive an objective? If you really care about managing driver safety, telematics is an absolutely indispensable tool in that area. So you get that real-time monitoring of what's occurring and how to go after it. Information around where your vehicles are located, et cetera. But it all comes down to understanding what you're trying to solve with it and then what you're going to do with the information that you have. Because there are some fleets, they deploy telematics on everything. And then they go, look, we have all this telematics data. And it's like, well, what are you doing with it? We're not sure. And then other fleets just are absolutely brilliant about how they apply that to help manage those behaviors and those other X factors that traditional fleet data sets don't provide. The last point I would make on it is telematics is largely here, whether we want to be in the ecosystem or not. Every single vehicle that rolls out of an assembly plant today is coming fully featured with telematics. Ford is collecting more data on you than you are on yourself in some cases in terms of your vehicle and how it operates. So understanding there's value in that information. It's all about how it's being applied and used. Is that valuable for your fleet? Is it necessary for your fleet? And electrification and certain things in the future will at the very least require connectivity, which is essentially going to be a feature of telematics in the future of how the car can talk to central systems as well as to charging infrastructure, et cetera.
I think one interesting point you just said, though, we have a lot of customers that they put that technology into their vehicles for, say, one reason or another, right? And they use it for that, but they have all this other information and they don't know what to do with it. But what's neat is if there's some sort of challenge that you and your team get pulled into the customer to solve, a lot of times it's easier to say, well, we already have this information and we can start to model it and then directionally point them to whatever solution they're looking for.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I see we have enough material here for a sequel or at least a docu-series, but unfortunately we're out of time for today. For anyone who asked a question that wasn't answered, we will be following up via email to answer your questions individually. We certainly hope that all of you have gained some valuable insights from today's webinar. I would like to again thank Trip, Ed, Jennifer, and the teams at Holman and Automotive Fleet for today's presentation. This webinar will soon be available on demand on the Automotive Fleet website at automotivefleet.com/webinars. On behalf of our team here at Bobbitt, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again right here for another webinar on Automotive Fleet. Have a great rest of the day.